Hi, and welcome to Daily Dose of DevOps. The last video I mentioned that I had a coding problem during my previous interview. It was pretty simple. It was a bash coding problem with a little Kubernetes sprinkled in. It was pretty easy. I'm not going to say it's going to be easy for everybody, but it was on the more simpler side. So I was happy about that. It kind of gave me more confidence going forward. If you haven't worked with multiple clusters or even a kubeconfig file, if you haven't looked at it too often or too much, then hopefully this video might help. And I suggest that you kind of learn a little bit about this. You could get it in your interview. It's just something good to know as well. So let's just jump right in. I'll explain what the interview problem was and how I went about solving it, and then we'll jump into looking at the kubeconfig file after we recreate it, and I'll show you the different parts of it. So this problem was you can no longer communicate with any cluster when you run kubectl commands. So if you run kubectl, you used to be able to run kubectl get nodes, and now you're just getting this. You're just getting a connection to the server was refused. So typically your kubeconfig file lives in your home directory, okay? .kube, and there's usually a config file in here. There is no config file here at all. There's another thing, you can also export kubeconfig equals, and you can specify a location of the kubeconfig file. So looking at my environment variables, I do not see any kubeconfig variable being exported. I don't see any value being exported for kubeconfig. So that's the problem. We can't get to the cluster because there is no config file, and we don't have access to the nodes in the cluster, so we can't pull the kubeconfig file from there and bring it locally. So how do we recreate the kubeconfig file? So this bash script was at most 4 lines, I think, which were 3 kubectl commands and then 1 echo command. So it was really pretty simple, but let's go through it. So there's 3 parts of a kubeconfig file, and we'll go over that later visually, but there's clusters, users, and context. So the clusters are actually clusters that this file has authentication for. So you can have multiple clusters in here and just switch the context between them. There's users, a user section, which are user accounts which have access to the clusters. And then there's context. And context marry clusters and users together. So there's clusters, users, and context. And we'll go over those later. And you'll see them more as we go through this lesson. So if you run a kubeconfig, a kubectl, there's a command kubectl config. And you can see all the available commands here. This kubectl config is modifying kubeconfig files using subcommands, okay? So this problem, they said that there's a directory kind, and within this directory there's a certificate authority CRT file, there's a client CRT, and there's a client.key file. And there's also a server file which lists the actual API URL. So this cluster I created is local. This is the address of the Kubernetes API server. So with all this information, how do we recreate a kubectl file, a kubeconfig file? Do we actually just go in and vi config and create one this way? We could certainly do that, but that would be very mistake prone. So let's actually look at kubectl config. So if we go through kubectl config, we see that there's a set cluster, a set context, and a set credentials. Those are the 3 subcommands we're going to use here. So let's first start by creating a cluster entry in kubeconfig, and we can do kubectl config set cluster. Okay, and you can see that there's options that you need to create here as part of this command. So kubectl config set dash cluster, you give it a name, we'll give it kind. The server, we already know that the server is, let's grab that again. This is the actual server URL. So let's go back in kubectl config set cluster kind dash dash server. We'll put in the server URL here. We can put in the certificate authority, and that is located in the kind ca.crt file. And do we need anything else? That's all we need. So you see cluster kind was set. So you can see now that there's a config file set here, and you can see that there's a cluster section here with the certificate authority and the server. So can we do a kubectl get nodes now? No, this file is not complete yet. So once we've set the cluster, we now need to set a user. So let's see what files we have available in kind. And then let's look at kubectl config, and we want to set credentials. And looking at the options here, we have to give it a name. We'll give it name kind. Then we'll specify a client certificate as it states here, and that path is to kind client.crt. And then we also need to give it a client key, and that is located in kind client.key. I think that was the name of it. Client.key, yeah. So is that all we need to do? Yes, that's all we need to do. So now we can go in and we can look at config. And we can see that now there's a user section as well. So can we run kubectl get nodes yet? No, it still doesn't work because we haven't set a context and that marries these two entries together. So let's do that, kubectl, and we can do config, and that was set context. Let's look at the options here, set context, and so cluster was equal to kind, user was equal to kind, those were the entry names that we gave them. And you can also specify a namespace if you wanted to jump right into a particular namespace for this cluster, but we'll leave that empty also. So we didn't set, we have to give the context a name, so we'll give it kind. So you can see that context kind was created. So now we can look at the config file, and you can see it has a clusters section, has a context section, and it has a user section. So that should be good enough for us to go to use kubectl get nodes. And we can see that it's still not working. Why is that? Let's look to see what current context we're in. So you can look at the different contexts that this particular config has, and you can see that we have one context that we just created called kind with a cluster of kind and auth info of kind, but we haven't set to use any current context right now. So if you're using multiple clusters, you can switch between contexts by running kubectl config and then use context. And in this case, we're going to use kind. Okay, and if you go back to get context, you can see now the current context is kind. So if we run a kubectl get nodes, there we go. We can do kubectl get pods, and you can see all the pods as well. Okay, so then how did I write this script? I mean, it's simple. You know how to write a bash script, I'm sure. So all I did was just take those commands. Did I wipe out my history? So all I did was just take this command, the set cluster, the set credentials, and the set context, put them on a separate line on the bash script, and then that was it. And it was that simple. So let's look at real quick the Kubeconfig file, the config file that we just created, just to kind of show you how it's formatted. Like I said, it has 3 sections: clusters, users, and context. So you might have multiple cluster sections in here, or I'm sorry, you might have multiple clusters that you're managing. So you'll see multiple entries for clusters, multiple entries for users, multiple contexts. So I mean, I manage many different clusters at one time, so you can just switch between those clusters just using kubectl config and use context and switch to whatever cluster that you want to manage. So if I, let's just look at lines 2 to 6, and you'll see that this is this cluster section. So this is the section of the file. So this file has access to any clusters that are here. So this cluster, we specified the certificate authority and the server. So it has that information. If we then want to look at just the users, we can go to 15 to 19. You see that there's the user section of the config file. And then, like I said, the context section marries it all together here. And so after we enter those 3 commands, as long as we have the certificate authority files and the client certificate and the client key, as long as we have all the information, we have those files readily available, then we can regenerate the the kubeconfig file. So sorry for any errors in these videos. I do minimal editing, just kind of want to get this out there and hopefully help you on your next interview. Like I said, I am interviewing all the time. I'm interviewing a lot, and so I hopefully will have a lot more information to share. I'm interviewing for systems engineer roles, DevOps roles all the time, SRE roles. So hopefully I'll have some more interesting. I actually do have some more interesting content that I'll be sharing. So hope this was helpful. Have a good day.